So, as I said, we're going to be looking at the parable of the person building their house on the rock and the sand. And like the story of Noah, this is probably a familiar story, but there are a few aspects that make it very poignant. And the first one is its position. This story, this parable, comes at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. In the book of Matthew, the Lord spends 3 chapters giving us teaching after teaching at the beginning of his career. And then he ends it with this parable. And so we're going to read that, Matthew 7. We'll look at this story in that context of coming after all these other teachings. Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on the house, and it fell, and great was its fall. And so it was, when Jesus had ended these sayings, that the people were astonished at his teaching. For he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. And now I'm going to read a passage from the Teachings from the New Church, or the Heavenly Doctrine, telling us about how our faith is perfected. This is from True Christian Religion, number 352. Faith is perfected according to the abundance and coherence of truths. This is evident to anyone who collects reasons and observes carefully what multiplied series of them effect when they cohere as a unit. For then one series strengthens and confirms another, and together they constitute a form which, when put into action, is manifested as a single act. True faith, by an abundance of truths, cohering as if in a bundle, also becomes more lustrous, more perceptible, more evident, and more clear, and becomes also more capable of conjunction with the acts of good, consequently more capable of separation from evils, gradually more removed from the enticements of the eye and the lusts of the flesh, therefore in itself happier. Especially does it become more powerful against evils and falsities, and thus more and more living and saving. Now finally, from the Arcana Celestia 8928, a short passage talking about people who are in faith but not in charity. It says, "They do not arrive at that light of perception in which they may see for themselves that faith does not exist except where charity does, or that the one belongs to the other as one does to another in marriage, and therefore that charity is the essential element of the church because of its coherence with good." Amen. So the story we read, the parable from Matthew, the house on the rock, like I said, it comes at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. It's this very impactful ending to one of the longest stretches of the Lord preaching to people. Right at the beginning of his ministry, he goes up onto this mountain, 3 chapters worth of teachings, and he ends it with this. It's in this section where we encounter teachings like the Beatitudes, loving your enemy, the fulfillment of the law. All of those things ended with this story. It's a well-known story. You've probably heard it before. And initially, it can seem innocuous. We can pass it off as a simple thing. It's short, something that could easily be packaged in a set of proverbs. And if you're familiar with correspondences, you might at first see the rock and the storm and think, that's truth, And when you're founded on truth, that protects you from falsities and temptations, the storm. But there is more to it. The story is placed here at the end of the Lord's Sermon on the Mount, after he's given all these people so many truths, because the story tells us that it's not enough to just have truth. At first glance, or thinking about it quickly, we might think that the rock is probably truth, and so the sand would be the opposite, falsity, which might make sense if we're thinking quickly. Falsity isn't sturdy, and so if we tried to build our life on that, it would give way to temptation. But the sand isn't falsity. The sand is also truth. The Lord said the person building their house on the sand is someone who hears his word but does not do them. It isn't someone who doesn't know enough or doesn't believe the right things. It's not falsity or the lack of truth. It's truth we don't use. Think of all the knowledge we gather in our lives. Most of us spend most of our lives, all of our lives, perpetually learning. We learn new skills and techniques for our jobs. Anyone who's raised a child will tell you how much learning happens in that process. We learn when we go to church or chapel, when we go directly to the Lord's Word. And on top of that, we take in more knowledge every day from learning about our friends' lives, from the news, school, education, or an article your friend shares with you. We take in so much knowledge. And not all of it is truth, but plenty of it is. We can think of all those little tidbits of knowledge like grains of sand. So many, they're forming a vast beach in our lives. And we can walk on that sand. We can live our life just having most of these beliefs, most of that knowledge, and rarely putting it to use. Our faith, our beliefs, all the things we think can usually rest on that sand. That's the Lord describing us building a house on the sand, on just knowing things. We can build it and it will stand. We can go around with all the elements of our worldview based on things that we heard and we believe, but we haven't put to the test. But when we do this, and especially when we do this with our faith, we risk making a foolish mistake. Because when temptation hits, when the wind blows and the rain falls heavily, when the rivers rise up against the house and flood it, the house will fall down. We can get by most days with our faith untested. But if we do not live the truth that we believe, then there's no way to stand up to temptation, to the forces of hell that want to drag us down. If again we imagine those truths as individual grains of sand, it's easy to see why they would get washed away by a flood. The little pieces of truth just sit there on their own, and when the flood comes, when we're inundated by false ideas or overwhelmed by emotional ties, those little truths can get brushed aside easily when confronted with another idea. Like, why would a loving God let something bad happen? If we don't live that truth, it can wash away as soon as it comes into conflict. If we merely know a truth like God is love, that's all fine and good, and it's better than not knowing that. But when something bad happens, that idea, that truth, just flows away, and we focus on how could a loving God let that happen? If we know we're supposed to honor our parents, but we normally don't really think about it or do anything about it to actively live it, then what happens when one of our parents says something rude to us, unintentionally or not, or brings up something we find offensive at a family dinner? How much harder is it to not respond in anger, to not lash out with a rude comment, if we haven't made honoring our father and mother part of our life through active choice. If we've never made the effort to say, I'm going to keep the Sabbath day, how much harder is it on a Sunday morning to actually make yourself come to church instead of sleeping in? How much harder is it to make yourself read the Word instead of saying, I have something I want to get to, I'm just going to put that aside? Any truth that we merely have, anything we know that we haven't made the effort to enact in our life, is a target. Maybe you've never been faced with the temptation to steal, and so you don't really think about it. When you go into a store, you're not worried that you're accidentally going to steal. You think, I've checked that box, no worries. That can become a target, a weak point where the hells can aim because you haven't faced that temptation. If you haven't actively resisted it, then you haven't built up a resistance inside of you. Truth on its own disintegrates in the face of temptation. Faith not put into action falls apart under duress. The heavenly doctrine says this directly. Our reading from the Arcana talked about this, where it said those caught up in faith alone do not see that there isn't actually any faith unless it's joined with charity. And vice versa. Now, we don't need to look at this as a reprimand or a judgment, because every single one of us has some place in our life where the truth we hold hasn't been tested. It's a challenge we all face in order to not fail in temptation. But there is more to it. Our passage from True Christian Religion talked about the way faith is perfected. It said it's the abundance and coherence of truths. The abundance part is simple. The more we understand, the better prepared we are to face falsity with truth. That house wouldn't be able to stand even on a rock if the rock was too small. It could only support one part of the house. So we know we need to keep learning new things all the time. But the focus of the story here is on the coherence part, on sticking things together. We need to build our house on the rock, and we know that means we need to build our lives and our faith on truth that has been put into action. But what makes the rock different from the sand? Right? The rock is truth, and the sand is truth. But the difference is that those grains of sand have been transformed into the rock. A grain of sand is a tiny fragment of a mineral, and a rock is countless tiny fragments that have been brought together, cohering into one body. The difference comes from the process that makes the rock. Let's think about how sedimentary rocks are made, like sandstone. It starts with small, loose grains of sand and other various minerals, and they're compacted. Layer upon layer goes on top, and more pressure forms until the little pieces start arranging themselves into the right order, and eventually they fuse. The small, tiniest particles fill the gaps of the larger ones until eventually they form a rock. And it's the same with the individual truths that we hold. As we apply them, as we put them to the test, as we put them under pressure, they naturally start coming together. We begin to connect ideas and arrange them, bringing what previously have been individual truths together. How do we live out the idea that God is love? Well, if God is love, then He wants what's best for everyone. And if He wants what's best for everyone, then the commandments He gives are leading to personal happiness and greater social happiness. And so we should follow them individually and societally, right? And so God is love when you attach it to those other truths, those other ideas you have, you can live it out. And when you live out following the commandments, with all of those ideas behind that, and when you live them out and you see yourself become happier, when you see other people become happier when they live them, those truths become cemented in your heart and in your mind. That's the rock. The rock is the same truths we had scattered about as sand, but put under pressure, put to the test in our lives and joined together layer by layer with other truths. And you probably really know this already. You've seen it in action in your life. Whenever you've followed through on the decision to make a good habit, you've been building that rock. If you've made the effort to actively honor your father and mother, to reach out with them, to connect with them, to thank them for what they've given you, then you've seen this happen. You've seen the other truths that support this commandment. The importance of loving your neighbor, including your parents. The importance of having gratitude for the things that you've been given. And when these truths are all held together and put into practice, and you've built a mutual, loving relationship with your parents, then when they say something that offends you, or hurts you, or they make an off-color comment at a dinner, you can easily stand up to those hells that want you to lash out in return or give a snarky comment. And when you do, when you choose to do that, you connect more truths. Like the idea that we all have personal flaws and challenges. Like the idea that the Lord commands us to forgive people who have slighted us. The truth can support us in temptation. It can hold us up when the hells try to bring us down. But it needs to become a rock first. If we make it a rock, through putting it into practice, making it coherent and consistent, then that house can stand, no matter the storm that beats on it. We spend most of our lives learning. Every day we gather more information and hopefully more truth. It's the way we live, and there's nothing wrong with it. But if we stop there, it's not enough. We could pile up sand to the heavens, and the storm would still wash it away. It's the pressure of living the truths that connects them and cements them together. It's only by being forged in the crucible of life that these individual truths, the grains of sand, can come together and become a rock, anchored in your life that you can build on. Amen. Please bow your heads for a prayer.